You are kneeling on the cold marble floor of the convent of St. Theodosia. The air is thick with the smell of burning cedar and old incense, but beneath it there is a sharper scent, blood and unwashed bodies. You can't see the sky, but you know the sun has risen because the stained glass above is glowing a dull, smoky orange. 3 days ago, you were a bride of Christ, protected by the holiest walls in the world. You lived in the Queen of Cities, Constantinople, the eye of the Christian world, the guardian of the true cross. You believed that if the end came, it would come from the infidel, from the armies of the East. You were wrong. The men who broke down the bronze doors at dawn didn't carry the crescent moon. They carried the cross. They wore heavy chainmail and surcoats embroidered with the symbol of your own savior. They knelt to pray before they drew their swords. But when they looked at you, they didn't see a sister in faith. They saw a spoil of war. They saw a Greek heretic. And they had been told by their priests that purging your sin was holy work. This is the betrayal that broke the back of Christendom. This is April 1204, and the men tearing the veil from your head are not Vikings or Saracens. They are Crusaders, and what awaits you in the next few hours will make you wish the city had been taken by pagans instead. The Catholic Church and the history books of the West would spend the next 800 years trying to soften the blow of this day, calling it a tragic mistake or a deviation. But for the thousands of nuns trapped inside the burning walls of Constantinople, it wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated, sanctioned, and systematic desecration. This is the story of the Sack of Constantinople, the day Christians did to Christians what the devil himself would hesitate to do. The most terrifying part isn't the violence, it's the justification. The Crusaders believed that by destroying you, they were serving God. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. It helps us keep unearthing the voices that history tried to silence. But before you understand the nightmare of 1204, you have to understand the paradise that was lost. Constantinople in the early 13th century was not just a city, it was a civilization. While London and Paris were still muddy towns of wood and thatch, Constantinople was a metropolis of gold and marble, home to 500,000 souls. It housed the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so massive it was said to hang from a golden chain from heaven. Inside its convents and monasteries lived tens of thousands of consecrated women, nuns who spent their days copying ancient Greek texts, tending to the poor, and maintaining the rituals of the Orthodox Church. These women were the spiritual elite of the empire. They were untouchable. Even during the frequent palace coups and riots of Byzantine politics, the convents were sanctuaries. No Roman soldier, no matter how corrupt, dared to cross the threshold of a bride of Christ. It was a taboo etched into the soul of the East. But outside the walls, a storm was gathering. The Fourth Crusade had been launched with the intention of liberating Jerusalem. But through a series of political twists, Venetian greed, and unpaid debts, the massive army of French knights and Venetian sailors found themselves not in the Holy Land, but camped outside the walls of Constantinople. They were hungry, they were broke, and they were fueled by a deep, simmering hatred for the Greeks. For centuries, the Great Schism had divided the Church. To the Latin Crusaders, the Orthodox Byzantines were effeminate, treacherous, and spiritually wrong. They weren't just political enemies, they were heretics. And in the medieval mind, a heretic had no rights. A heretic's vows were void. A heretic's chastity was a lie. When the order finally came to attack the city to collect the debt owed to them, the Crusaders didn't view it as a siege of a Christian city. They viewed it as a harvest. On the morning of April 12th, the walls were breached. The Venetians, masters of the sea, drove their ships right up to the sea walls, using flying bridges to storm the towers. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's loyal axemen, fought fiercely, but the city was eating itself from the inside. Panic spread like a virus. The emperor fled, the defenses collapsed, and then the fires started. 3 massive fires swept through the city, destroying more houses than existed in the entire city of Paris. In the confusion, the nuns of St. Theodosia, like those in hundreds of other convents, gathered in their chapels. They locked the heavy wooden doors. They lit the candles. They began to chant the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. They believed that when the Crusaders arrived and saw the cross on the altar, they would stop. They believed that their habits were armor. They were naive. The first sign of the horror was the sound. Not the sound of battle, but the sound of laughter. Drunken, raucous laughter mixed with the crashing of metal. The Crusaders had found the wine cellars. When the doors of the convent splintered under the blows of axes, the women didn't see liberators. They saw demons in iron. The French knights and their sergeants poured into the sanctuary. These were men who had taken vows to protect the weak, to honor women, to serve the church. But the laws of war declared that for 3 days the city was theirs to sack, and sack meant everything. The gold on the altar, the silk on the walls, and the women on the floor. The nuns were dragged from their knees. The abbess, a woman of 70 years who tried to stand between her sisters and the soldiers, was struck down with the pummel of a sword. The younger nuns, many of them daughters of the Byzantine aristocracy who had taken the veil to escape the world, were cornered against the iconostasis. The Crusaders didn't just attack them, they mocked them. They tore the veils from their heads, laughing at their short-cropped hair. They ripped the golden crosses from their necks. One account from the historian Nicetas Choniates, who was an eyewitness to the destruction, describes the Crusaders grabbing the Holy Eucharist, the body of Christ, and throwing it on the floor so they could strip the jewels off the chalices. Then they turned to the women. The violence that followed was not random lust, it was a performance of dominance. To the Latin Crusaders, these Orthodox nuns represented the arrogance of the East. By violating them, they were punishing the Greek pride. They raped them on the cold stones of the church floor, directly in front of the icons of the Virgin Mary. They raped them on the altars where the nuns had taken their vows of eternal chastity. It was a deliberate inversion of the sacred. The Crusaders screamed insults in French and Italian, calling them Greek whores and schismatics, telling them that their vows to the wrong church were meaningless. But the horror didn't end with the assault. In the Viking raids, women were taken as slaves to a foreign land. In Constantinople, the torture was that they were left in the ruins of their own home. After the initial violence, the selection began. The Crusaders weren't looking for farm slaves, they were looking for pleasure and profit. The nuns were herded out of the convents and into the streets, which were now running with blood and choked with smoke. They were stripped naked, a humiliation that, for a Byzantine woman who was raised to cover every inch of skin, was a psychological death. They were paraded through the Forum of Constantine. The Crusaders played games with them. They would force the nuns to dress in the stolen finery of the imperial court, putting heavy, jeweled robes on women who had sworn poverty, painting their faces like prostitutes, and forcing them to dance for the soldiers' amusement. If they refused, they were beaten. If they wept, they were mocked. The grandest church in Christendom, the Hagia Sophia, became the epicenter of this nightmare. The chronicles tell us that the Crusaders brought horses and mules inside the cathedral to carry away the gold and silver. When the animals slipped on the polished marble and fell, the soldiers killed them right there, letting animal blood mix with the holy water. And on the Patriarch's throne, the seat of the spiritual leader of the East, they placed a French prostitute. She sat on the high altar, singing bawdy-drinking songs, spreading her legs while the soldiers cheered. The captured nuns were forced to watch this. It was a message: your religion is a joke, your God has abandoned you, we are the masters now. For the nuns who survived the initial 3 days of the sack, a new kind of hell began. The Latin occupation of Constantinople lasted for 50 years. The Crusaders didn't just leave, they stayed. They divided the city among themselves like a pie. The convents that weren't burned down were commandeered. The nuns who hadn't fled or died were turned into forced concubines for the new Latin lords. This is the worse-than-death aspect that few talk about. In a Viking raid, you are a slave to a pagan. It is clear he is the enemy, you are the victim. But in Constantinople, the man forcing himself on you went to Mass on Sunday. He crossed himself before he ate. He claimed to be a soldier of Christ. The psychological dissonance broke the minds of hundreds of women. They were forced to serve the men who had defiled their sanctuary, forced to wash the blood off the armor that had killed their brothers. Many nuns believed that this was the apocalypse. They believed that God had truly turned his face away from the Orthodox people. Suicide became an epidemic in the convents. Nuns threw themselves from the high walls of the city or drowned themselves in the Bosphorus rather than endure another night with the soldiers of God. The church in Rome knew what was happening. Pope Innocent III had explicitly forbidden the Crusaders from attacking a Christian city. When news reached him of the sack, of the rape of the virgins dedicated to God, he was horrified. He wrote letters condemning the violence, calling it a work of the devil. But he accepted the gold. He accepted the relics. He accepted the political control over the Eastern Church. The condemnation was just words on parchment. The reality was that the Vatican absorbed the wealth of Constantinople while the women of the city were left broken in the ashes. The nuns who became pregnant by their rapists faced a terrible fate. In the strict Orthodox culture, a nun who had lost her virginity, even by force, was often viewed as spoiled. When the Byzantines eventually retook the city decades later, these women remained outcasts, living ghosts in the ruins of their former lives. They bore the children of the enemy, children with French eyes and Greek faces, living reminders of the shame of 1204. One specific story that survived in the oral traditions of the Greeks concerns the convent of Pantocrator. It was one of the wealthiest in the city, famous for its hospital. When the Crusaders broke in, the nuns, led by a calm, stoic abbess named Eudoxia, refused to scream. They refused to run. They stood in a circle around the sick patients in their care, linking arms. The Crusaders, enraged by their silence, didn't just violate them, they tortured them to break their composure. They wanted the satisfaction of hearing the heretics beg. They burned them with torches, cut them with daggers. Eudoxia was reportedly tied to a pillar and stripped, while the Crusader captain demanded she renounce the Orthodox rite and kiss his ring. She spat in his face. He cut out her tongue. She died days later from infection, but the legend says she never made a sound of pain, denying them the pleasure of her fear. These stories, whether embellished by time or starkly true, reflect the absolute trauma inflicted on the psyche of the East. The Sack of Constantinople created a divide between the Catholic and Orthodox churches that has never truly healed, and at the heart of that divide is the memory of the nuns. For the Greeks, the Crusaders were not misguided brothers, they were monsters worse than the Turks, worse than the Persians. The Turks were enemies of the faith, which was expected. The Crusaders were Judases. They kissed the cheek of Christ and then sold his brides for silver. The looting of relics was so extensive that today, if you visit the treasury of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, you are looking at the stolen heritage of Constantinople. The gold cups, the jeweled icons, the crystal chalices, many of these were ripped from the hands of weeping nuns in 1204. Every glittering treasure in Venice has a shadow of a woman's scream behind it. The psychological concept of moral injury is often applied to soldiers, but it applies to these victims too. A moral injury occurs when your understanding of right and wrong is fundamentally shattered by a betrayal of authority. These nuns had dedicated their lives to a system that promised them protection in exchange for devotion. When the very soldiers of that same God violated them, the universe ceased to make sense. It wasn't just physical trauma, it was spiritual annihilation. They were left in a void where prayer felt empty and the cross felt like a weapon. The chronicler Nistas Choniates wrote, "Even the Saracens are merciful and kind compared to these men who bear the cross of Christ on their shoulders." That sentence alone encapsulates the horror. To be a nun in 1204 was to realize that there was no safety, no sanctuary, and no honor among Christians. This story matters because it dismantles the romantic myth of the Crusades. We like to think of knights in shining armor, riding to save the innocent. But the reality of war, religious or otherwise, is always written on the bodies of women. The Crusaders of 1204 were not heroes. They were opportunists who used religion as a shield for their sadism. They proved that a cross on a tunic does not make a man holy, and a sword in the hand of a believer is just as dangerous as a sword in the hand of a barbarian. The 23 nuns of Lindisfarne faced the Vikings and suffered, yes. But the thousands of nuns of Constantinople faced their own brothers in faith, and the betrayal cut deeper than any Viking axe. As the years passed, the Latin Empire of Constantinople began to rot. The Crusaders, busy fighting amongst themselves and defending their stolen land, slowly lost their grip. The city was a ghost of its former self. Weeds grew in the cracks of the Hagia Sophia. The palaces, stripped of copper roofs, leaked rain onto the rotting floors. And in the shadows of this decaying grandeur, the surviving nuns grew old. They became the keepers of the memory. They whispered the stories to the young novices who eventually returned. They told them not about the glory of Rome, but about the cruelty of the West. They taught them that the walls of a convent are only as strong as the men standing outside them. When the Greeks finally retook the city in 1261, They found a population that was traumatized, cynical, and hardened. The restoration of the convents was a slow, painful process. The women who returned to the veil did so with a different understanding of their vows. They were no longer brides of a triumphant Christ, they were survivors of a suffering Christ. In the end, the Crusaders failed. They held the city for 50 years, but they lost their soul forever. The sack of 1204 is the reason why 200 years later, when the Ottoman Turks were at the gates, a famous Byzantine official said, "Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara." It was a choice born from the memory of the nuns. They knew what the papal tiara brought. It brought rape, fire, and the desecration of the holy. At least with the Turks, you knew where you stood. The legacy of those days is still with us. If you walk into an Orthodox church today and ask about the Fourth Crusade, you won't hear about military tactics. You will hear about the tears of the Panagia, the Virgin Mary, weeping for her violated daughters. We dig up these stories not to create hatred, but to understand the scars of the world. The history of women in war is almost always a history of silence. They are collateral damage, footnotes, spoils. But on this channel, we give them a voice. The Nuns of Constantinople were not just victims, they were the witnesses to the ultimate hypocrisy of the Crusades. They bore the weight of the schism in their flesh. And though the Crusaders tried to humiliate them into oblivion, their story survived. It survived in the anger of the East, in the guilt of the West, and in the dark, unquiet corners of history that we are only now brave enough to explore. If this descent into the darkness of 1204 opened your eyes, if you felt the cold marble and the heat of the fire, make sure you are subscribed. We are working on a video about the secret torture chambers of the Spanish Inquisition, and believe me, it only gets darker from here. History is a graveyard, and we are the grave diggers. See you in the next one.